In our discussion today, we are going to talk about dopamine, a molecule that's associated with motivation and reward that we make in our brain, and how different schedules of dopamine release predict whether or not we will stick to a habit or not, and in particular, whether or not we will be able to form that habit quickly or not. Now, this is absolutely critical to understand for the following reason. Another thing that you'll hear out there in the literature is that it takes 21 days to form a habit. Some people say 18, some people say 21, some people say 30 days, some people say 60 days. So which one is it? Does it depend on the habit that one is trying to form, or does it depend on the person that's trying to form the habit? Well, it turns out that there's excellent peer-reviewed data on this. There's a study published in 2010, first author Lally, L-A-L-L-Y. This study found that for the same habit to be formed, it can take anywhere from 18 days to as many as 254 days for different individuals to form that habit. The reason I bring this up is that I always get asked, is it true that it takes 21 days to form a habit? Is it true that your nervous system changes in 6 days when you're doing something repeatedly? And the answer is, as I mentioned before, it's highly variable. What I didn't tell you actually was what specific habit they were looking at in that Lally study. And it's interesting that the specific behavior was a health-related behavior. It's pretty relevant to our discussion here on the podcast, which was taking walks after dinner. There's actually a really nice literature showing that walks after a meal can speed glucose clearance from the bloodstream, can be beneficial for not just weight loss, but cardiovascular health, etc. So a walk after dinner seems pretty straightforward, right? Well, in order to form that habit, it took some people 18 days and other people 254 days. How did they know when they formed the habit? Well, they were doing it about 85% of the time. And they also reported not having to spend that much mental effort in order to get into the mode of taking a walk after dinner. So for those of you listening, some of you might be thinking, I can't believe that it would take some people 254 days to get into that habit. But as I said, people are highly variable. And if you can't form one habit easily, it doesn't mean that you can't form other habits easily. The mystery of why certain people can form certain habits more easily than others probably has something to do with how well people manage what's called limbic friction. Now, limbic friction is not a term that you're going to find in the formal neurobiological literature or even psychological literature. It's frankly a term that I coined to encompass a number of different pieces of the psychology and neuroscience literature. Limbic friction is a shorthand way that I use to describe the strain that's required in order to overcome one of two states within your body. One state is one of anxiousness, where you're really anxious and therefore you can't calm down, you can't relax, and therefore you can't engage in some particular activity or thought pattern that you would like. The other state is one in which you're feeling too tired or lazy or not motivated. Both of those states, feeling too alert and too calm, if you will, relate to the function of the so-called autonomic nervous system, a set of neurons and hormones and chemicals in your brain and body that act as sort of a seesaw. You're either alert or calm. You're either asleep or stressed. Those two states are not compatible with one another. You've probably heard of wired and tired, but that's really once you've been very stressed for a long time to the point where you're exhausted. What does the autonomic nervous system have to do with any of this? Well, limbic friction is a phrase that can be used to describe how much effort, how much activation energy you need in order to engage in a particular behavior. So using this Lally study as an example, some people would eat dinner and then say, oh, that's right, I'm trying to develop the habit of taking a walk after dinner, so let's get up and go. Other people will feel like, I just don't want to do it today. They're going to feel too much limbic friction, and that limbic friction could arrive, again, from one of two sources. It could be because they are too tired to do it, or it could be because they're too anxious and distracted in order to do it. So this is a key distinction. A lot of habit formation has to do with being in the right state of mind and being able to control your state of body and mind. So as we march forward, what you're going to find is that this phrase or this term, limbic friction, is going to be a useful metric or way for you to touch in with yourself and address whether or not you are likely to be able to form a certain habit easily or whether or not it's going to be very challenging. And I'm going to teach you a way to measure your degree of limbic friction, that is, how much activation energy it will take in order for you to execute a new habit. And I'm going to teach you how to measure your limbic friction and activation energy for how likely it is that you're going to be able to break a habit that you don't want to have. The other key concept for us to address that's really mainly found in the books and articles out there about habits is this notion of what I call linchpin habits. Linchpin habits are certain habits that make a lot of other habits easier to execute. Now, the sorts of linchpin habits that I'm referring to are always going to be things that you enjoy doing. I'll just give you an example from my life. I happen to like exercise, not all forms of exercise, but I happen to like resistance training and I happen to like running. So I'm personally in the habit of getting cardiovascular exercise 3 or 4 times per week, maybe 30 to 60 minutes per session. And I'm in the habit of doing resistance training 3 or 4 times per week, typically also for about 45 to 60 minutes per session. Now, I enjoy those, and for reasons that I'll get into a little bit later, I place those activities typically early in the day because of the neurochemistry and the various types of hormones, et cetera, that are associated with performing those activities. But I really place those activities under the umbrella of what I call linchpin habits. Why? Because those particular habits are easy to execute because I enjoy them, but they also make a lot of other habits easier to execute. Things like being alert for work, things like making sure that I get good sleep the night before, things like hydration, things like making sure that I eat the foods that are better for me than maybe some of the other foods that I would more reflexively reach to if I weren't doing that training. So certain habits act as linchpins, meaning that they shift a lot of other things. They can control and bias the likelihood that, in this case, you or me, will perform other habits that are harder to access, that we have less of an affinity for. So again, there's 3 concepts that we need to include here. We've got identity-based versus goal-based habits. We've got the concept that different habits take different periods of time to adopt, depending on the person and the habit, and that there are these, what I call linchpin habits, certain habits that make other habits easier to execute. And those linchpin habits always are things that we enjoy doing. So our goal throughout this episode is for you to identify which habits are easy for you to perform, which ones are hard for you to perform, and which habits you want to break. If you want to grab a pen and paper, you can do that, or if you want to dictate some of that into your phone, you can. But right now, actually, if you just want to think about these concepts, you can always go back later. I'll make sure to spell out a very specific way that you can chart out a map towards forming particular habits and breaking particular habits later on. What I'd like us to do at this point is to take that concept of limbic friction and for you to ask yourself what habits you perform on a daily basis. And these could be things as basic as brushing your teeth before breakfast or brushing your teeth after breakfast. It could be for instance, that you get exercise or you get it at a particular time of day, or even that you take a particular route to work, right? We are very habitual and we tend to do things more or less over and over in the same way unless we intervene in ourselves. That's just the way that we are wired.